I'm Pat Duffy. I'm the president of Houston, of Colliers, not of Houston, just Colliers. Graduated first in my class from Harvard, of Central Louisiana, actually. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Bill Gilmer. And Bill is the director of the Institute of Regional Forecasting at the University of Houston at the Bauer College of Business. The Institute monitors Houston and Gulf Coast business cycle, analyzing how oil markets, the national economy, and global expansion influence the regional economy. Before joining the Institute, Dr. Gilmer served as the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas for 23 years, retiring from the bank as a senior economist and vice president. He joined the Houston Bank branch of the Federal Reserve of Dallas as a senior economist in 1989, focusing on energy markets and regional growth. His work on the Texas economy has been recognized in publications such as the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, and Forbes. And he served the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas as the officer in charge of the El Paso branch from 2003 through 2012. He said he had $500 million in small bills in the basement. Apparently he left it there, I'm not sure. He was born in Amarillo and grew up in El Paso, where he got his Bachelor of Arts in Economics from the University of Texas. He later earned his Master's of Arts and a PhD in Economics from the University of Texas at Austin. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Bill Gilmer. The down arrow.
All right, thank you, Patrick. Let's see if we can get this all to work. Yes, I do understand that. Okay, so we're in business. Now I'm gonna talk about the Houston economy today. I'm going to go lots of directions with the national economy. But basically, let me just start with where we're going to wind up today. Let's start with the bottom line, and then as we wind through this, you'll understand exactly where I'm headed. First of all, I'm just going to assume that COVID is behind us, the virus at least, is over. That may or may not prove to be the case, but we're going to assume that for today. And I'm going to assume, however, that COVID has left us with a significant economic policy mess that needs to be cleaned up. We had a mistimed stimulus, far too much cash, an outbreak of inflation, a Federal Reserve that acted way too late, and now a Federal Reserve that is determined to slow the economy. So obviously, we have some interesting times just in front of us. Now, the Fed has responded now. And I think the bottom line from that is that as we talk about the U.S. economy, a major factor in Houston's growth, then the U.S. economy is probably headed to something like zero employment growth for a 12-month period that's right in front of us. Let's just say 2023. And we're talking about perhaps 1 to 2% GDP growth. That's the forecast from the Survey of Professional Forecasters, for example. And oil and fracking, they don't mean what they once did to Houston. They've changed. They're still important. But it is a smaller and slower growing industry. And there's a reason for that. This is not about the environment. This is about the fracking industry now recognizing that it serves a different role than we once thought it did. So with little support from oil, little support from the U.S. economy, we're talking about if we were to see $80 oil this year, then we might see 25,000 jobs. And without that, if we see $65 oil, we could possibly see no growth in Houston for the coming year. So it's not a great forecast. But let's put that aside. That's where we might be going, where I think we're going. But let's look at the recent past. And here's a survey of what's happened to us over the last couple of years. This is the best measure we have of the Houston economy on a grand scale. And the blue line that you see here is national payroll employment. The red line is Houston's payroll employment. You can see the long trend upward. We come to early 2020 with the lockdown period. With that lockdown period, Houston loses 365,000 jobs in 60 days, and the national economy, 22 million. Houston doesn't fall as far, and that's because the lockdown rules were less stringent in Texas than the rest of the country. And you see a bigger bounce back in the US because the lockdown rules were more stringent there, and it's like releasing a rubber band that's been tighter, and so you see a better bounce back on that blue line. Now, once we're on our way, as you can see, toward recovery, Houston and the US economy actually perform almost exactly the same over this time period. When we get to April of 2022, April of just this past year, Houston finally adds back those 365,000 jobs last April, and the US economy adds back its 22 million last April. They're on the same track, basically, throughout this recovery period. However, if we look at the state of Texas, the picture's not quite so favorable for Houston. We look like a bit of a laggard here. If you were to look at Houston, we added back those 365,000 jobs, and we wound up with 452 by this December. In other words, we added all the jobs back plus about 24%. And we did that by April, as I said. But if you look at Texas, we added back all of those jobs about 6 months earlier, and we've now added back 140%, all the jobs in 40%. But look at Austin, all the jobs in 80% and nearly a year earlier than what happened in Houston. Now, what happened? Why are we lagging these other major metros? The answer, look at the line for Midland, Odessa. Midland, Odessa has added back 60% of its losses to the pandemic. That, not 160, it's added back 60%. So it's way behind. And if you say, well, Houston has a very large oil sector, and if it's behaving like Midland and Odessa, then indeed it might be a bit of a laggard. And in fact, that is, in fact, pretty much the case. Houston, not too different from that in terms of oil. Let's talk about that stimulus. These are national numbers. And what you see here is changes in income-related activity. And as bad as employment was, the federal government stepped in to make the income numbers look much better using the stimulus packages. 3 stimulus packages. If you see that red line there, that's wages and salaries that were for the United States. And you can see the big drop during the pandemic. We lost about 10% of wages and salaries during the pandemic, and then begin to move forward and move back to pre-pandemic levels by December. That blue line includes the 3 stimulus packages, the one that falls almost right on top of that lockdown period. And in fact, if we lost 10% of wages and salaries, having nothing to do with stimulus, then at the same time, we see that total income actually rose 10% right in the middle of the pandemic. Then we have 2 more rounds of stimulus. In late 2020, early 2021, another $2.5 trillion. $2.5 trillion is a lot of money. It's about $17,000 per American family, and we did it twice over. So certainly there was a lot of money sloshing around, and you'll notice that in terms of income throughout the pandemic and through today, we have never been richer before than during that pandemic period because of this help from the federal government. Now, I think a lot of the blame does rest with the stimulus. The timing says it. This is a study that was done by the San Francisco Fed. The San Francisco Fed, that blue line is the outbreak of inflation that we saw. as we track it with the CPI. And if you look at that red line, that's the San Francisco Fed's estimate of where inflation would have been if we had skipped the second 2 rounds. Now, there is a risk here. If you look at that red line, you can see that it actually goes negative for a few months. And it says that we were at risk of deflation. And that's a serious risk. It's very difficult to get out of deflation. So we probably needed some stimulus. Really, the question is, and the question they raise is whether we really needed $2.5 trillion again for that second round of stimulus money. And it is time, the outbreak of inflation comes right on the heels of the stimulus in terms of timing. In fact, if you look at the broken line, that is our red line and our blue line adjusted for inflation. What looks like big gains in income turn out not to be so big once we take the inflation out of it, and we're talking about 3 to 5% total increases since the pandemic in income over this entire 3-year period. So, yes, I think there was certainly a role here for the stimulus. And the stimulus is probably its most direct impact comes on spending. The consumer got the money, and yes, the consumer spent the money. What you see here is U.S. retail sales. And if you look at the left side of the chart, you see the decline in retail sales, of course, during that lockdown period. But then the pandemic arrives, and we recover almost completely with retail sales almost immediately on the heels of the pandemic. But then move further along that line where you suddenly see that big jump upward. And that is our second and third round, $75 billion a month in additional spending that just continues right on. If you look at the red line, that's adjusted for inflation. The blue line includes inflation in terms of retail sales spending. But if you look at that red line, even with inflation removed, consumers were managing to spend as if they were far above pre-pandemic levels of income. Now, that continued spending through 2022, through last year, is odd in the sense that all of the stimulus, as we've talked about it, ended. It ended at the end of 2022, all of the paycheck assistance, food assistance, unemployment compensation. Most of that disappeared by the end of 2022. I'm sorry, by the end of 2021. It was all, and so it really continued all through 2022. There's a little bit of money left in expanded Medicare, expanded child tax credits, and college loan forbearance. Actually, all that's left today is the college loan forbearance, which was just renewed for the 7th time, I think it is. But how did they manage to spend through 2022 when, in fact, the stimulus had ended? The answer is it wasn't spent all at once. Much of it was saved. Savings, the typical year for Americans, they would save 7 to 8% of their income. If you look at the savings rate on the left side of that chart, it shows that during the pandemic, they actually jumped up. Savings rates in some months actually jumped up to 35% when the money was being distributed. And only across 2022, with the stimulus over, do you really begin to see the savings rate fall sharply, and we're eating into savings. We're well below our traditional savings rate. The chart on the right is the total amount that went into savings, about $2.5 trillion. Now, you have to be careful with the savings idea here. We're going to take taxable income, we're going to subtract out goods and services, and it's everything that's left over. Now, as long as what's left over remains highly liquid in a bank account, then it can be spent immediately. But a lot of this wasn't so liquid. It might have gone into a retirement account. It might have been stock purchases. It could have been real estate that was being purchased. Not liquid at all. You're not going to pay your grocery bill with your existing home, bigger existing home. Or maybe it was meme stocks, or maybe it was crypto. Who knows? So we're waiting to see. We really don't know how much liquidity there is. But just the last couple of few months, we have finally seen both adjusted, unadjusted, the consumer begin to pull back. It's been a long wait, but finally the consumer is beginning to give in a little bit. And all of this, yes, that was U.S. numbers, but it all carries over right to Houston without any question. We fully participated in all of this in Houston. I don't have good retail sales numbers exactly like the U.S., but these are the retail sales collections by the city of Houston, and these are the same chart. They look very, very similar. This is the 1% the city collects, and it is basically the same story. And let's look at a couple of the big spending items in Houston. This is auto sales, for example. And you can see a COVID pattern in there, but it's not a very dramatic pattern on sales. And that's because cars were scarce. We were having problems, a big chip shortage. And so it was hard to buy a car. So we took it out on the price side. In other words, more people were competing for those automobiles as a result. And so we started the pandemic with the price of the typical auto in Houston, auto or truck, at $40,000. And today, and for the last several months, we're sitting right at $52,000. So about a 30% increase in the price of the typical auto over that time period. And if I look at existing homes in Houston, they say you don't know a bubble until after it burst. I think now we know that this was a bubble almost without any question. We had the pre-COVID period, the fall into the lockdown period, and then suddenly, with help from a drop in interest rates and a check from the federal government, existing home sales were running 27, 28% above pre-pandemic levels. Then we come to the end of last year, and inflation, rising mortgage rates, maybe to some extent even a lack of inventory for a while, played a role in turning this all around, and now we are 40% below pre-pandemic levels in terms of sales, 40% below. Inventories of these existing homes are rising. The price of an existing home over the pandemic period, rose 35%. The typical existing home in Houston rose 35%. It's leveled out. Will it fall? Well, history says it might, based on certainly the 1980s, based on what happened in 2008. But then again, we've seen other periods where it has leveled off and just stayed flat for a very long period of time. So we'll see. Now, what about the Fed? The Fed has intervened. These were the Fed firemen. They have come late to the game. And what they're going to be watching is a little narrower definition of inflation than what you and I know. This is something called the Personal Consumption Expenditure Core Inflation Deflator. How's that for a mouthful? I actually said it without stumbling there. But it's basically like the CPI, but they take out oil and food. They take out oil because they can't control oil markets, and they take out food because they can't control the weather and the crops. So apart from that, if we look at what has happened over the last 12 months, the 12-month rate of growth of inflation is seen on the left side of this chart. And while we've made progress, it's come down from about 5 to 4%. So we're still far above the Fed's target of about 2%. And it would be nice to know what has happened recently and to have a better picture than just the last 12 months. But the numbers are quite volatile. And so maybe it's okay to be smoothing these things a little bit. Maybe it's not. But be careful in terms of exactly what's going on. But if we include food, of course, and if we include oil, gasoline, for example, obviously inflation jumped up to well over 8%, including those factors. It's come back down to close to 6%, so we're making some real progress on a 12-month basis. And again, the volatility on the right side makes it hard to assess exactly what's happening in recent months. The Fed is focused on expectations. They're less concerned about exactly what is happening than in convincing the consumer that those prices are coming down. They don't have to be building big wage increases into it. And they're making progress here. We can look at consumer expectations, which are down significantly. The consumer still has at an elevated level compared to everyone else, but at high levels. The survey of professional forecasters says probably 3.2% inflation here this year and about 2.5% next year. And financial markets are very optimistic. Financial markets have about a 2.3% inflation rate averaging out over the next 5 years. And these are based on Treasury-protected securities, inflation-protected securities, and should be some reasonably meaningful figures. Now, is the Fed making progress in slowing the economy? That would be our next question. I have some measures here. These are the measures that the National Bureau of Economic Research looks at as the official arbiter of a recession. So they're going to be looking at industrial production, which in fact is down, so the Fed policy seems to be going to work there. Merchant wholesaler sales, they're flat. They peaked last July. Retail sales, well, we just saw that they're down about 0.5 percentage point in recent months. Real personal income, excluding those transfer payments, they've basically been flat since October. And if you look at real personal consumption, that's actually been flat since late 2021. The strength, the real strength is in employment. It's in the labor markets, extremely strong labor markets. And this will be the Fed's target as they move forward, barring anything else. Can the Fed slow inflation? Oh, yes, they can. They absolutely have the tools. It's a matter of political will. They were embarrassed by what happened by letting the genie out of the bottle this time around. They have professional reputations. They have legacies they're concerned about. So don't have any concern that they will move forward if they need to. Unless there is an immaculate disinflation, Bloomberg loves that expression, the immaculate disinflation. This is somehow prices just manage to fall back without the Fed doing any more. We wake up one morning and find out it's basically gone. But in the event that doesn't happen, the Fed will be targeting that strong labor market as sort of the last bastion, and it'll be a matter of when it cracks, I think, rather than if. And so we're talking about probably a policy rate peaking out near 5%, probably holding at around 5%. These are COMEX futures that are adjusted and massaged by the Atlanta Fed. And they'll hold it at that high level for most of this year and then move forward. And note that by 2025, we're talking about a policy rate, not zero, like we've gotten used to, but closer to 2.5%, according to these figures. So we'll see, but the Fed is determined to move forward. Now, that's probably 60% of Houston's employment growth right there. And we're talking about probably zero employment growth over the course of this year, or for 12 months starting fairly soon. And let's talk about oil. This is another 30% of Houston's job growth in recent history. And oil prices have been up. They've been up for a while. They have been above $70 a barrel since about June of 2021, after we saw COVID in retreat, the vaccination programs, very little OPEC capacity. The economy turned around at that time. But at the same time, we're not seeing great progress in terms of what is happening in the oil markets. And this is about the fracking industry. It's about fracking. This is a different industry. This is not these giant companies from Shell and Exxon. This is more like a competitive industry, lots of small and medium-sized companies that work here, low barriers to entry. The traditional exploration risk has pretty well disappeared here. The problem for the industry is that it was born with a silver spoon in its mouth. We're talking about $100 oil, for year after year. This is an industry that relies on $60 and $65 oil to make money. But at $100 a barrel, these guys were geniuses. They could mint money. OPEC intervenes in 2014, and they say, look, you guys are a high-cost source of oil. You're producing way too much oil for our market. Let us show you what happens if we take the price of oil to $40 a barrel. And that's exactly what they did. They took it to $40 a barrel, and Houston promptly lost 80,000 oil-related jobs in the course of 2 years. So OPEC says, lesson learned, 2017 now, takes the price of oil back up to around $70 a barrel. These guys just go right back to work, right? They go back to work, and OPEC says, okay, $50, we'll show you again. And when they do that, it sets off another big round of bankruptcies. They cannot make a dime in profits, and we're going to find that they are not going to make a dime in terms of equity. In fact, if you look at the equity for these companies, this is the S&P Oil Index, producers and services lose 75, 80, 85% of their equity value between 2014 and 2020. 3 rounds of bankruptcies, if you throw in COVID, 3 rounds of $300 billion in fracking assets taken through the courts, and these companies are basically at death's door. To solve that problem, they adopt a completely different model of operation, a new way to do fracking from a financial perspective, and they basically say, we now know we are not a growth stock. We thought we were, but we're not. And so we're now going to be a value stock. We're now going to divert about 30 to 40% of all free cash flows will be devoted to our investors or to improving our balance sheet from this point forward. So that is, by definition, a formula for a much smaller and slower growing industry. And that is exactly what has happened if you look at what is going on in the oil fields. The rig count is still a good measure of what happens in the oil fields. And you can see that we peaked back in 2014 with 2,000 working rigs in the United States. OPEC intervenes the first time, that falls to 400 working rigs. OPEC raises the price and it goes back to 1,000 working rigs. Then comes the third round with the credit crunch. Then comes COVID, and we're down to 250 working rigs. And the recovery so far, despite $70 oil for 18 months, is still bringing us about 750 working rigs at the present time. And Houston, if we were to begin in 2014 and ask how many oil-related jobs there were, upstream jobs, there's 240,000. Today, there are 160,000 jobs in Houston. And just in this last round, it brought another loss of, we subtracted 44,000 jobs with this last round of downturn and with COVID, and we've only added back around 17,000. So it is a smaller and slower growing industry as we move forward. So even with $70 oil, we're going to see a bit of a struggle by these companies compared to anything we have seen in the past at a price like that. So the local drivers are oil and the U.S. economy. Oil, we just saw, we're not likely to see great progress there. $65 oil or $80 oil. I'm going to use $65 for a medium forecast, $80 for a higher forecast. And we're going to stick in that range, but understand they don't go higher. If the price of oil goes to $100 per oil, they're going to think of it as more like a rainy day fund. They're going to take that $100 and fortify their balance sheets to the extent they can against the day that the price is once more $40 per barrel. So zero growth in U.S. employment, very limited progress on oil, and our forecast for Houston looks something like this. Now, I've spread the forecast. I have a high forecast based on about $80 oil, a medium forecast based on about 65, which is sort of the intermediate price, and then a low forecast that would be on 40. So we've got 40, 65, and 80. And I put 100 on here because everybody wants to know, what if $100 oil came back for a prolonged period? And the answer is it will never again mean certainly quite what it did in the past. So the bottom line here, this is the change in total Houston payroll employment from year to year. Now, during the pandemic, we lost 193,000 jobs year over year. And then in 2021, we added back almost all of those jobs, about 170,000. Then this past year, I have put in there 126,000 jobs. I'll qualify that in a minute. It's red for a reason. But this coming year, it's probably, if we saw $65 oil, probably somewhere between something like 5,000 jobs. Virtually no job growth for Houston. Next year, limited growth compared to our long-run trend of around 60,000, but then a return to long-term growth shortly after that. Now, that 126,000 I put in there for last year, if you open up the computer and go to the Texas Workforce Commission website, they will tell you that their current estimate is for 178,000 jobs having been created last year for a variety of, the problem is that it's based on a very thin sample. The sample has not been updated since the third quarter of 2021, and we are likely severely overestimating. These estimates have a long history of bad results. The Dallas Fed has done a preliminary result, looked at the paperwork that accompanies this. They have already cut it down to 117,000, and that is without looking at the second half of last year yet in terms of the extent that these samples are too big. I'll be surprised if it doesn't go under 100,000 by the time the samples are complete. So here's my last slide, and this is simply the 40, 65, 80, high, medium, low, $100 oil that you can study at your leisure if you're really interested. I highlighted there what happens in this year with either $65 or $80 oil, and it's either 5,000 jobs if it's only $65 oil. And if we do see $80 oil, that could jump up to around 25,000 jobs. But it's really the Fed at work in the background that's doing most of the work here. Okay, do we have time for some questions? Yes. Yeah, okay. Anything I talked about you want to know more about, or anything I didn't cover for you? Yes, sir.
What are your thoughts with China coming online?
Yeah. You know, I looked at the IMF forecast. I'm glad you asked. I looked at the IMF forecast, which came out just this morning, 7:30 this morning. And I guess there were two big factors that were considered when we said, well, we had an incredibly gloomy outlook last October. Those of you that can see this giant cloud about to swallow a European city, that was what the IMF felt about the economy this time last October. And two big issues. One, Germany squeaked through with its on oil prices. That was not a severe winter in Europe, and oil was just not the big issue it could have been. And the other is China and the reopening. And even with those improvements now built into this forecast, it's actually lower than last year for the global economy. And the reason for that is that inflation peaks amid slow growth. So inflation, basically, the problem is twofold. If you look at Europe in particular, we're talking about a war in Europe, which has caused this inflation outbreak. It's been a big piece of that just keeping it going. I think it started earlier with the pandemic, but this is just keeps adding fuel to the fire. And the other part of the other war that is on is the Fed busy trying to stamp down that fire, and all the central banks around the world. So you're actually seeing, if you look at the changes in global growth as a result of incorporating China and the European situation, what you see is that it is a significant decline from last year in the developed countries of the world, in Europe and in the United States. And if you look at China, growth improves, but from around 3% up to around 5%. So, and actually the forecast looks like just pretty much what I described for Houston, with a really a no-growth situation for the globe, getting slightly worse next year. So again, it is not a happy forecast. 3% growth on a global basis in global history, those are terrible numbers. The picture's an adequate description of the IMF's view of things. Another question. I bummed you all out, didn't I?
One more.
Yes. Yeah. You know, we have a high birth rate, and that gives us large population growth. And in 25 years, they'll be wonderful to have those consumers. But you have to be careful with the in-migration figures. We had huge in-migration into Houston during the oil boom period from 2010 to from 2008 to 2012. We had 100,000 jobs. We had 100,000 new jobs created locally, 100,000 move-ins. Population growth just exploded for Houston. After that, it turned sharply negative because of the oil bust. We actually had some significant losses for 4 or 5 years, and it finally, over the last 2 years, has turned positive. But if you want to compare it, I'm sorry, but if you want to compare it to Dallas or what's happening in Austin, that is where the Texas population growth boom is taking place. The in-migration boom has taken place. It's less apparent in the total figures for population growth in Houston, certainly than the rest of the state. So, yes, sir.
What positive impact is the growth of the Port of Houston having on your analysis?
Well, that's great. It is. It is very positive. And that has been largely the work of the LA Long Beach Port. And we can thank their labor situation. And the strike they had there, I think, taught a lot of employers that they need at least a backup alternative. And so we have certainly seen some significant growth at the port. And it's good because as we lose these, well, we're not losing oil exports yet, but if you look at the history of the port, we're always proud of these numbers that say we're the second largest port in the nation after the port of South Louisiana. But it's all tonnage, and it is all liquid exports or chemical exports. It all has been oil historically. And so this does give us some real diversification at the port, where for the first time we're actually talking about bringing bulk goods in, and of course the warehousing boom that, well, you can explain that better than I can, I bet. So, all right. Thank you guys very much.
A couple of years ago, I think 2010, if you remember back then, we had a fairly difficult environment, and in lieu of an economist, we had a double talker come and didn't tell anybody. We introduced him as being a economic advisor under several presidents, and we may have to do that next year again. So just I want to warn you in advance. Bill, that was great. Thank you very much. All right, so I'm going to now run through very quickly. I have other good news. The bar stays open after this, so yes, yay, and there's still some food. So we were going to give everyone an egg as a gift for coming this evening, but we couldn't get any. So you're just going to have to grab like a deviled egg and take it home for your spouse. So a couple of things. We made some predictions last year. It's always fun to go back and look. And our team put this together, but we hit about 90% on our projections. So thank you, Molly, by the way, for putting that together. And there's some conflict between the rosiness that we put up and what Bill just said. I admit that. But we're fairly bullish on what's going on. And is this year going to be difficult? Sure, it is. Bill touched on single-family housing. The single-family market, and our interest, we're commercial. We don't sell houses, but we do sell large tracts of land that are turned into planned communities, subdivisions, et cetera. So we're more in the lot business than we are in the home business at this level, but the drop-off is real. I will tell you that sometime around late Q3, I think we had at least, and I hate to say this to my land guys in the room because they weren't happy about it, I think we had 5 or 6 large tracts of land under contract to national home builders who universally dropped the contracts, almost within a week or two of each other, across the board. We did see a couple of private family type offices on the smaller ones come in and pick those up and get going again. But the housing volumes are down. That makes sense. People can't afford the down payment. Prices of housing got out of control. And when you take interest rates from 3% to 6%, the debt coverage on that just kills you. And so that dropped way off. But here's the other side of the equation. We've got historically low lot inventories. And with any growth at all, we're going to be short on housing. And Dr. Doutzer from A&M said, if you need a house, you better buy it because we're not supplying them fast enough. And I can tell you that the lot supply is going to have a major lag because we're taking a year off from what has been a fairly steady flow of lots. That's going to drive prices, hold prices up or drive them up. And when it comes time to build them, it still costs a lot to build. So we're selling houses for the most part at or below replacement cost of a home. And lot costs are going to be going up. So we see that as picking back up. We're hearing from some of the national players that they're going to be back in the market in a year. One group actually asked us to buy the property for them, which we don't do very often. And they would agree to pay us I think it was a 12% return, but not guarantee that they would take us out on the back end. But they want the property. So oddly enough, we didn't do that. Bill talked about migration. Texas is number one. Unfortunately, as he pointed out, most of that is going to Austin, Fornia and DFW. And they can have some of that crowd. They're welcome to it. But the migration does exist, and as the Texas economy goes, Houston does benefit from the growth in those other markets. Retail. The retail market, this is the retail market these days. It's restaurants, it's entertainment. You get the people like Academy Sports, they're out still doing their big box stuff, but the number of big box players that are out there are thin, but the restaurant world has gone crazy, and we're getting, I think this is one of the best eating towns in the world. You could eat out every night in Houston, not repeat, and not get a bad meal. I'm a foodie. So, you know, we love being part of that. And the vacancy in retail is down to 5.2%. We absorbed 3.9 million feet last year. That was up from the year before at 3.1. That makes sense. It takes time to gear back up after COVID. We only have 2.3 million square feet of space under construction right now, and half of that's pre-leased. So we have 60% of what we absorbed last year in the construction pipeline, which means retail gets tighter. I was talking to Mike Baker earlier. Sorry to call you out, Mike, but little props. He was saying, I'm out of space. I need to build another center, and we love that. That's the line on retail. We have rents $25 to $85. You can take that to the bank, except sometimes it's more and sometimes it's less. It just depends on where you want to be. Retail is one of those things that the average temperature on the moon is comfortable. If you have a great site, everybody wants to be there. You can charge more. It's how it works. All right. So where is it being built? The gray is pre-leased. The blue has some vacancy. Generally speaking, build-to-suit stuff and the single-tenant retail is going to be pre-leased. A lot of centers, by the time they get them almost to CO on the first couple of tenants, they're fully leased up. There's only one big project underway right now, and that's Weitzman's deal down in Manville. The next biggest one is a 181,000 square foot center that Newquest is doing down at Fort Bend 2, Fort Bend Town Center. So the grocery is still active. And this is just chasing population growth and running up and down the highways as we get 290 fixed and 99 is working, and that's going to open up some of these other markets. In the investment world is where we've really seen the brakes slammed on in Q3, Q4. So we used medians instead of average because the averages get skewed so bad. And you can see that on a per square foot basis, we're about even with the rest of the country, $285 a foot. Cap rates, the median last year was 7.3, but if you look in Q4, it went nuts. On even single tenant net lease stuff that we were trading in the low 5% cap rates, they're now solidly at 6.5, 7, depending on credit, term, location. There's always, again, caveats, but there's a lot of investors that they just can't make the numbers work in the low 6s. We're seeing some 5s, but unless you're a cash buyer, if you're out borrowing at 6, even interest only, you want your cap rate to be above the debt cost, and it's not. Otherwise, you've got negative leverage. So we've seen that across the board in all product types, and that slammed on the brakes. We were involved in a Tesla, which is semi-retail deal up in Indianapolis, and the developer walked from $600,000 in costs because the cap rate had gone above what it was going to cost him to deliver it, and Tesla wouldn't adjust. So between cost increases and cap rates going up, they figured they would lose less money walking away from $600,000 than finishing the job and selling it, and it's caused a lot of lockup. And this is debt, and returns. It's really not the fundamentals of the underlying retail. It's not an overbuild situation. It's the debt markets. On the multifamily side, get here. Did I go too fast? Too far. Here we go. So occupancy for multifamily has dropped a little bit down to 90.6% overall. We had a very slow absorption, and this speaks to what Bill was just talking about in terms of population growth. Net, we only absorbed 4,400 multifamily units. We lost a lot out of the Bs and Cs that moved into the As, but the year before we had 18,000 units absorbed. We're building 20,000, so that needs to pick up. I do think that because the single-family housing market is so difficult, people are going to have no choice but to rent apartments. And so you'll see that improve. It's still very healthy. Rents have fallen back a little bit, but we may be overbuilding a little bit unless the population growth continues. I do think the single-family lockup will help multifamily. In terms of the where are they being built? Everywhere, if there's a site. The beauty of Houston and no zoning is there's no zoning. So if nothing else works, build an apartment complex and hope that it leases up and sells. Inside the loop, very tight, and it's still difficult to get things done, but there are pockets that are at 97% occupancy. Newer product is still the sexy thing, as it is in most property types, multifamily and office in particular. Price per unit, Houston had gotten fairly high and has dropped back down. Cap rates have spiked. We had cap rate, we were doing deals in the 3s, which I never understood. And now we're up around 4.8 to 5. But the volume has dropped off to almost nothing. Deals are getting traded, but sellers for the most part are saying, why would I sell? There's no point in it. I've got a nice product. It's cash flowing. I'm not going to go into an exchange and go buy something else. I've got decent debt. So unless there's something triggering them to sell, they're just not going to sell. So the gap between the buyer and the seller is huge, and that volume is dropping down. What is trading is somebody with a story. Their debt's maturing, and they can't replace it, and they don't have the equity to clean it up, so they move on. So there's a lot of that going on, but the volume of sales is way down. And that's going to be across the board for investment sales. The office market, I think here we go. Yeah, it's the colors. So the office market has been the problem, and that is tied directly to oil and gas and everything that Bill just said. We built an enormous amount of office space for the oil industry. There's been a ton of consolidation, and there aren't that many players out there. Exxon built 4 million square feet for themselves. That's one energy company, but when they did that, they vacated 4 million square feet in other parts of Houston, and they consolidated up to their campus. Now they're talking about potentially putting part of that campus on the market. So there's been a big shift there. The Oxy merger with Anadarko created an empty building for Howard Hughes up in the Woodlands. Last year, the Woodlands was yellow, and that was 100% because of that merger. One big building getting dumped onto the market increased their vacancy, and we over here you can see the vacancy rates. It's back to light green because we've had a year and a half, 2 years to lease that building up. It's almost full, And if you talk to the Howard Hughes folks, they're now eyeballing building another building. They've been very good about maintaining an inventory level commensurate with the growth in that northern market. And I expect that one to be dark green again by next year. Sugar Land went from light green last year to red, and that's been mostly move-outs, floor being a big part of that. But it's been an interesting market. The dark green markets that you see on here that have very high occupancy, low vacancy, they don't have a lot of product. I mean, there's a few buildings. So anywhere there's a big concentration, you've got high vacancy. And the tenants are licking their chops, but I need to warn you, there are a couple of submarkets that get in line. So if you're looking at City Center, Memorial City, a couple of pockets up and down the energy corridor, even out at Park 10, our tenant representatives are coming back and saying, I just lost a deal. I had a whole floor for somebody and somebody outbid me on it. And we haven't heard that one in a while. It's pockets. But if you want to be in one of those live, work, play environments, like City Center, like the Woodlands, like Memorial City and a couple of the other little pockets, everybody else does too. And those buildings are doing quite well. The newer construction has been winning. It was at about 11 or 12%. That's bumped up a little bit. But the new product is working. Unfortunately, that results in developers deciding, well, if the new product works, I'll just build more new product. And that comes online. I got spanked by Skanska when they built what is now the NCNB building because I was quoted as saying, I wish they wouldn't do that. And their chief legal counsel is a friend of mine. He called me and said, thought we were friends. And I said, well, we are, but you're screwing up our market. And then they sold it for a record amount of money and laughed at me. But that's unfortunately how it works. I don't see the office market getting a whole lot better. We did go into positive as opposed to losing 1.9 million square feet the year before, but the office market's got all kinds of issues. The energy sector not coming back to suck up the space is our biggest one here in Houston, but the globe has a problem with people trying to figure out what work from home means and whether or not people need to come in and out of the office. Now, Elon took over Twitter and said, get your butts back in the seats. And we're hearing that from more and more companies. The first of the big multinationals that we heard doing that were really the stock guys on Wall Street saying the intellectual transfer from our senior people to bringing up our junior people requires that we be in the office. There's productivity issues. Productivity in the United States has dropped. So we can talk about how great work from home is, but what I tend to accomplish at home is cleaning out my refrigerator. So it is a threat to the office market, although the trend seems to be more and more conversation about CEOs saying, you know what, I got to thin my herd a little bit anyway. So one of my tests is going to be, if you're not willing to come into the office and be there where I can see you and we can all collaborate and work, go someplace else. Now, Houston's done better on the work from home. We have been the highest back to work of any city in the country, more or less every month since they started publishing that a couple of years ago. But this market's going to remain fairly tough. There's going to be creative reuse. We're already hearing about office buildings being turned into residential towers. In some cases, there are buildings that get barely over operating expenses in rent. If you're getting $2 or $3 in net rent, you probably could tear it down, turn it into a parking lot if you're downtown, and make more money as a parking lot with a lot less headaches. So I think there will be some decisions to just say, you know what, it's time to bring these things down, and we'll just sit on the dirt and use it for parking until we decide to do something vertical. Metastar had a property on Derry Ashford. It was a medical office building that was obsolete, not very efficient. Their big tenant moved out. It's a lot. And some of these buildings need to be lots. They need to just go away. And that will be part of our solution. We've got a lot of very old product out there that just doesn't need to exist anymore. The new stuff's working. It's got better amenities, better floor plates. That's what people want. So got a couple more here, and then we'll be wrapped up. Industrial, yay. Thank you, industrial. It's all green except for that one little yellow one. Last year, the Southwest and the Southeast were both red from a little bit of overbuilding. Now they're light green, moving to green. We see that continuing. Bill talked about California, the gift that just keeps on giving. The Inland Empire, which is really the distribution focal point for all of California, has decided you gotta love these people. They don't want to be in the distribution business anymore, so they're not going to permit more large big box distribution. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Because in the meantime, between the labor issues and the backups at the port, we talked about this last year, at the peak, the West Coast had hundreds of ships sitting offshore, and at the peak in the Gulf Coast and up through the Atlantic, we had 6 ships backed up. So they went, hey, let's go there. Panama Canal is done, we've done our dredging, and they also figured out most of the US population lives east of the Rockies, and we've got incredible rail capabilities coming out of the Gulf Coast. With all of that, you know what? We need to move all of our distribution east. That's not going to change. That is a mega trend that is going to continue, and Houston will be a huge beneficiary of that. So what's going on the specifics? 5.6% vacancy, 33 million square feet under construction, but the spec stuff is slowing down very quickly. I mean, the developers we're talking to, it's mostly build-to-suit that they're focused on right now. So I think we're going to work through this, and then you're going to see a big slowdown in the speculative construction here, because debt's expensive and the exit rates are questionable. What can I sell it for at the back end? So that will slow down. I think you're going to see that industrial remains very strong. I know our industrial team is as busy as they've ever been. Let's see what we got. Oops, sorry. This one is an interesting one. Hello, there it is. We started looking at this for the first time back in 2020, and this was the light blue is the big 100,000 square foot and up boxes and their share of the market. So 13.4 million square feet out of 17 million. The next year, 13.4 again, but the smaller guys woke up. This would have been 2021. Last year, 20 million square feet of big box and 8 million of the smaller guys, but good solid performance. And we saw a slowdown again in the smaller side. Oil field services around here take up a lot of that small space. But solid absorption and record years for absorption in 21 and 22. On the investment side, everybody wants to own industrial, so this one's doing better than most. We have seen the price per square foot fall back a little bit. That's because the higher quality stuff the sellers aren't selling, if you want the short answer to that. If I've got a great product and nobody's going to give me the number that I want, I'm just going to own it. And we have less merchant developers in this type of space than you do on the retail or the multifamily side. There are very few multifamily players who are in it for the long haul. I mean, there are a couple of the REITs, but merchant developers are right now taking a break. I had a friend in Florida that had a house in the Bahamas. He called it Casa de Recesión, and he would retire during every recession, go over to the Bahamas, live over there, and then when the market came back, he would just grab his team and they'd go back to work. And he got to retire several times. Healthcare, probably getting out over our skis a little bit here. We've got 2.7 million square feet under construction. We absorbed a very healthy 867,000 square feet of medical space last year compared to 196,000 square feet of office, and there's only 42 million feet of this. But if we're building 3 times, is that 3? Yeah, 3 times what we absorbed this year, we might be getting out over our skis a little bit. Part of this is just population growth and dock in the box chasing new communities, but I think we're potentially getting fat here. Why does this happen? Developers say, I can't build regular office. I know, I'll go build medical. because they got to build something to keep the lights on. They didn't create a Casa de Recession. What else we got? Oh, this one's debt. So the debt market, whoops. Delinquencies are not that bad, but the Fed is now telling the banks they have to severely increase their loan loss reserves against loan failures. Most of that is not going to come through delinquencies because for the most part, these properties are operating fairly well. The issue isn't going to be that they're delinquent on their payments. It's going to be that they're loan balloons and they got an extra 200 or 300 basis points over the interest rate they were paying on their old loan. Most of what we're hearing from the lenders is kick the can down the road and do workouts and make it work. But when the Fed says to the banks, you have to increase your loan loss reserves, they have to set that money aside instead of lending it, and they've put their pencils down and they're not lending. So even if you want to pay the interest rate, it's still difficult to get loans right now. We just added 5 new debt guys to our team in Houston, which we're thrilled about, and we're spending an enormous amount of time with them seeing if they can figure out creative solutions to our clients' short-term debt problems. And it's been a great boon to what we're doing. We're thrilled to have them. So where are we in the cycle? And I say this every year. Sorry, it's an animated one. We make this up. There we go. So where are we? Retail is in expansion. It's tight. We're not building enough of it. And the demand keeps going other than the big box stuff. Office down here in the lower right. You can put it anywhere you want in there. It's going to live in that side for a long time, which is rents have stopped decreasing. So in fairness, the rents are not going down that much anymore, but we're way oversupplied in overall. I've got healthcare right at the top, and we might go ahead and push it over the side a little bit because we're getting a little over our skis, but it's at a smaller scale than the rest of this stuff. Industrial's fine. Again, we might be getting a little long in the tooth if that slows down, but so far there's been not a lot of signs of it slowing down. I did fail to mention a couple of the big boxes that were leased in the last 2 years have put their properties on the sublease market. We were involved in one 500,000 square foot, and it was a build-to-suit, and they decided not to even open, so they've put it onto the sublease market. So there's been some of that in the industrial side. Amazon has locked up. They were the big driver around here for a while, and they've just shut everything down, and the guy that was responsible for that division was canned. So one of the big drivers of industrial as a company has gotten off. But for the most part, I mean, we're healthy. We're in that expansion. Markets are working for the retail, the multifamily, industrial, and healthcare. Office is our big black eye, and that's the energy companies, if you want to take it down to one sentence. So that concludes my comments. Please stay and enjoy. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it, and hopefully you found this edifying.
I'm Bob Parsley, the chairman of Colliers here in Houston, and we want to welcome all of you to the annual Colliers Trends event, and hope that the presentations today will be very beneficial to all of you. To begin, however, I want to take a minute to introduce our 2023 Colliers Charity Beneficiary Care Partners. Katie Scott is the president of Care Partners and is here to give you a brief description of Care Partners and the work it does in our community to provide support, education, and resources to family caregivers and older adults who have dementia. Katie is a native Houstonian, a graduate of Rice University, and holds a Master's of Public Health from the University of Texas School of Public Health. For over 15 years, she has led multiple programs focused on supporting individuals with dementia along with their families. Founded in 1986, Care Partners is a nationally recognized nonprofit providing high-quality care for older adults and people with dementia, as well as their caregivers. Care Partners bridges the gap between healthcare and social services by offering programs across the greater Houston area which support caregivers' physical and mental health while accommodating their loved ones' needs, interests, and abilities. Since the agency's founding in 1986, Care Partners volunteers have delivered more than 3 million hours of free care, representing a value of over $84 million. This month, Care Partners staff assume the operations of the Dementia Day Center, formerly known as Sheltering Arms, the only adult day facility in Houston that serves individuals from early to moderate and late stage dementia. As our population ages, dementia and Alzheimer's become an ever-increasing part of our society. I'm certain that many of you have family members who have been impacted by these illnesses. We have few resources to support families who cannot provide 24/7 care for loved ones who have these horrible illnesses. The Dementia Day Center provides nursing care and personal hygiene assistance, a healthy lunch and snacks, and activities for its patients. Stimulation and socialization can help delay cognitive decline from dementia's progression. And because patients have a safe, reliable, nurturing environment during the day, they can continue living at home with their families, thus delaying the need to be moved into a nursing home or assisted living. Overall, adult daycare is annually about $40,000 less than long-term care options. My family has personally dealt with the issues related to dementia and Alzheimer's, and we have been supporters of the Dementia Day Center for almost 8 years. It is a cause that we all need to get behind. I'm happy to introduce you to Katie Scott, President of Care Partners.
Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. And, I don't have much to talk about. I think Bob took it for me. But I wanted to share with you a story, the story of the impact of what we do at Care Partners and the impact it has on the greater community. So I want to introduce you to Alicia and Sheila. When Sheila was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, her daughter Alicia got the hardest job of her life with no preparation, no training. She became her own mother's caregiver. As her mom's dementia slowly erased her memory, her words, and her independence, Alicia began taking on all sorts of tasks. Cooking and cleaning, she expected those. But medication management, healthcare decisions, those were completely unexpected. Not quite sure how to navigate this disease, Alicia came to Care Partners. Like many families struggling with this diagnosis, she was desperate for support. Though reluctant to ask for help, like many are, she knew she needed more than just how-tos. She needed a safe place for her mother to go so she could continue working to support her mother. From her very first call to Care Partners, Alicia knew she found the right place. She found information, she found security, and she found community. She learned more about her mom's conditions through our educational workshops. She also received help from our caregiver consultant and mapped out her long-term care plans for her mother. And eventually, she enrolled Sheila in our dementia-specific adult day center. Once her mom, Sheila, started attending the day center, Sheila found something too. A sense of purpose. Despite her challenges with memory and speaking, Sheila has become, actively still there, has become the center's greeter and is happiest assisting staff and other participants at the center. Sheila finally has a place where she can be herself again, with people who look past the label of her disease. And Alicia has the tools she needs to continue the long journey of caring for her mother. Alicia is not alone. Many people, in fact, many of you here in this room, either have been in her shoes or will be. As our community ages, we're approaching a crisis point in the need for services to support families with older adults. For over 35 years, Care Partners has been dedicated to supporting some of Houston's most vulnerable people. It is our mission to support all older adults, including those with dementia, and their families in whatever challenges they may face. So I would love to say that we are tremendously grateful that because of companies and individuals like you, we can meet Alicia's and Sheila's needs and the needs of many families like theirs. So on behalf of the Care Partners staff, our board of directors, and especially on the behalf of Alicia, Sheila, and the many other families walking this same journey, I want to express my gratitude to Colliers for choosing Care Partners as your 2023 golf tournament beneficiaries. So thank you very much. Now, one quick insert. I'm also excited to tell you that the impact of this golf tournament can be doubled. From today through the golf tournament on May 11th, the Parsley family is offering a dollar-to-dollar match for all donations received up to $200,000. So to help many more Alicias, and thank you, yes, it's wonderful. So to help more Alicias and Sheilas and many other families like them, you can refer to the card on your chair. Thank you so much.